Just to give you a little bit more information about both of our speakers, Trish, as I said, is a reader in social work and is social work lead at the University of Dundee. She joined the university in 2003, and she previously worked as a social worker within youth and adult justice settings. Her teaching, research and impact activity straddles community justice and professional learning, and she has a real interest in participatory and progressive approaches to research. And Trish has been kind of fundamental in leading on some of the developments in social work education across Scotland. So we're really lucky to have her here today. She's active in several practice and research projects, including in relation to professional learning, participation, co-production, social justice, and gender. So welcome along, Trish. Robin is a former colleague of several of us here in the session today, and Robin is a lecturer in social work at the University of Edinburgh and is a qualified social worker himself. He practiced in Scotland as a children and families social worker, and he's worked in an academic in different universities in Scotland, as well as the University of Sheffield in England. Robin's area of interest is primarily around children's services, and particularly practice with children in state care and the use of family group conferencing, the political governance of social work, and issues of diversity and identity within social work practice and education. And Robin played a key role in leading on the development of an online magazine for social work practitioners, academics and students during the early stages of the pandemic. So great to have you both here and welcome along. I am going to share the slides and then I'm going to pass over to Robin. Can everyone see that okay? Yep. Okay, Robin, over to you.
Thanks, Gillian, for the introduction, and lovely to be back at Strathclyde, if only virtually. The title is Newly Qualified Social Workers' Experience of Practising in Scotland under COVID-19. It was a study that was funded by the SSSC and is part of a larger study that Trish is leading on along with Scott Grant at the University of Dundee on newly qualified workers' experiences that follows them longitudinally over 5 years. So this was, if you like, a study commissioned within that framework, specifically looking at newly qualified social workers' experiences of practising in Scotland under COVID-19. I played a relatively small part in the research, primarily around literature review and some of the editing of the report. So I'm going to introduce the study in about 10 minutes or so, and then hand over to Trish for the more interesting parts of the study. I'm hopefully going to do some useful underlaboring for Trish in terms of just clarifying some key definitions and key issues surrounding the study, and hopefully not lapse into that academic tendency to unnecessarily complicate and problematize, but you'll be the judges of that. If you could move forward onto the next slide, please. So just a bit more about the research. It was looking at newly qualified social workers' experiences during the period of COVID, but the data collection was November 2020 to February 2021. I'll say a little bit more about that in terms of the waves of COVID in just a second. Mixed methods in terms of a national online survey, which gathered responses from about half the population of newly qualified social workers, 124, giving mainly quantitative data to closed questions, and also 12 semi-structured interviews that were conducted online. There was a mixed team of academics and practitioners, the academics primarily based at the University of Dundee at that time, and Dave Clark, who was at GCU for most of the study and moved back into practice subsequently, and Claire Ferrier, who I think was at Dundee, or is at Dundee City Council. And as I've said, it complements an important study that Trish and Scott Grant and others have and are being involved in on longitudinally following early career social workers' experience early career social workers' experiences, which I know from speaking to Trish is just close to completion at this very moment. Next slide, please. So in terms of definitions, newly qualified social workers, I imagine, is a terminology that we're familiar to most. It's commonly used across the 4 countries in the UK. Typically refers to social workers in their first year of practice and is linked in most of the countries to a developing probationary/assessed year of practice within the first year of qualified social work. Early career social workers, a broader definition that's used internationally, sometimes for the same thing, but also more broadly in terms of thinking about social workers' trajectories beyond the first year, and typically in the 5 to 7 years after qualification. So broader both in terms of international, but also the time span that we're considering post-qualification. Just a note on the different waves of COVID. So I think people, in terms of infection rates, are currently talking about 3 waves. So the first wave from March 2020 to around June, July 2020. Second wave when Delta emerged from around October 2020 to April 2021, which is when the data collection took place. And wave 3 probably from around mid-2021 onwards to the current time, when there are still high infection rates but lower hospitalisation rates, primarily due to the vaccine, but also the mutating form of the virus being less serious. What I'd say in terms of experiences of COVID, and one of the key messages that Trish will speak to is about the varied experience of NQSWs, is in terms of COVID, there are similar starting points but different detailed experiences. So communal baselines around experiences of COVID, higher risk of mortality, higher risk of illness, both for ourselves and those around us, some of the same fears and experiences, some shared experiences of lockdown, but those varied, particularly due to social factors, and as we're finding out, varied because not everyone followed the rules in the same way. And that's relevant in terms of social workers' experience and their variation, particularly as we moved on to waves 2 and beyond, that there were some regional variations around how COVID infection rates were hitting Scotland, particularly the west of the country was in lockdown, a more severe lockdown for slightly longer, and that may have shaped some experiences. Our data doesn't speak to how it was shaped by those specific things, but it's reasonable, I think, to bear that in mind just in terms of the findings that Trish will introduce. I will also say there's likely to have been cumulative impacts on practitioners. So the cumulative impact of working under COVID as time goes on and the pressure that puts on people, and also the possibility that needs to be borne in mind around time lag. So emotional, psychological impacts that may have come to fruition later and may still be coming into fruition. So a question that sometimes arises is why the focus on early career social workers and why under COVID-19? So I think there's a first easy answer around that, around the importance of looking at career trajectories and longevity. There's a statistic that I think comes from one paper that's often bandied around that frontline practitioners' time in practice is on average 7 years. I would argue that those of us that go into academia in similar roles are still using our social work skills and knowledge in relevant capacities, but certainly the length of time spent in direct practice is relatively small compared to some other professions such as medicine and psychology. I would also say that there's a professional responsibility that we have as teachers of students and people that teach social workers to look at the future of the profession and how those entering the profession find that experience, how they find their induction and training once they're in practice as well. There is a wider question when we're talking about COVID about distinguishing the impacts on practice in terms of how social work with individuals and families receiving a service changed, and the impact on practitioners in terms of practitioner well-being, development, competence and confidence in their role. What I would say is that they're conceptually different, but they're likely to be interlinked, most obviously in the strong negative association. So very unhappy practitioners are very unlikely to provide a service that is very good for individuals and families. At the opposite end of the spectrum, it's probably not true that there's a very simple relationship. So some of the factors that social workers could find increase their job satisfaction satisfaction don't necessarily lead to better services for families or better experiences of them. There was one example in the literature around the move to online hearings, court proceedings in children and family social work in England, which practitioners thought were far better in terms of their own practice and involving families, but families who attended them had very different experiences and found they were far harder for them to participate in. So I think it's worth to bear in mind that these things are interlinked, but they're also separate as well. Next slide, please. So just moving forward then onto the literature review that was undertaken. We primarily focus on peer-reviewed empirical studies around the impact on social work and COVID-19. We focused primarily on UK literature, but also sought international literature around the experience of early career social workers. So one headline was that we found no studies undertaken in Scotland met criteria. We did include some grey literature in the form of a couple of blogs, but at the time there were no peer-reviewed studies. And there was very limited data on early career social workers, so just one US study that we found at all. This was a study undertaken in New York, which, as people may remember, in wave 1 was one of the heaviest impacted areas by COVID. So a very interesting study, but a small scale one of around a dozen practitioners using focus group data, and which does have some similar findings, but some different ones to the findings that Trish will introduce. Just a few headlines before I finish and pass on to Trish on the key findings from the previous literature. So there were changes to practice, as people will have anticipated, but it's worth emphasising that hybrid social work practices continued throughout all the waves of COVID. That's to say that there was never solely online social work during this period, for statutory social workers at least. And that led to different challenges. So the challenges of delivering services online on the one hand, but also the increased challenges of deciding which visits should be face-to-face and who made that decision, and the discretion around making those decisions. The second important, I think, point to mention is the data does indicate or suggest that there were some marked differences across social workers' well-being according to their own estimations of that between waves 1 and 2 in COVID. Particularly in children and families work in wave 1, referrals reduced because schools closed and other referral sources reduced. That led in a lot of cases to reduced workload and some positives in terms of reduced travelling time, and I suppose some sense that we were all in it together in that earlier period. But the surveys later on and some of the later data, which is still coming out, suggested when it came to wave 2 that some of those early gains for practitioners had reduced, particularly workloads in children and families, but also other service areas were increasing. But also over and above that, there was, as I've mentioned before, a cumulative impact of COVID on workers' well-being. Finally, I just want to say, of the limited data available on early career social workers, it is suggesting, as for the wider workforce, that there are and were varied experiences. However, there was perhaps more indication that for early career social workers from the limited data that there were greater challenges and slightly more negative experiences for newly qualified social workers / early career social workers than their more experienced counterparts, and Trish will speak to that in a little more detail. So without further ado, I will now pass on to Trish.
Thanks, Robin. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining today. Okay, I'm just going to pick up really where Robin's left off. So just really my task is to kind of report on what we found. You know, what did we find in this study, what came through? And this first slide really just outlines the different areas that we looked at through the study. And it's really to give you a flavour, because I'll not be able to speak to all of these. So in terms of understanding newly qualified social workers' experiences, we looked at, if you like, kind of these 7 different sections. We looked at experiences of education. This particular cohort were completing their studies at the point that COVID hit in March. So most of them, not all of them, graduating or not graduating, and there's the first change, in around that kind of June, July time. So we looked at those kind of experiences of education in that period. We looked specifically at experiences of induction and early support, and that's an area that's got a lot of attention in the newly qualified social work literature, and also in current Scottish policy and policy beyond Scotland. We looked at ways of working, what were the kind of key changes in how social work was done within this period, both in where social workers were situated and in the places in which social work was done. We looked specifically at in-person work with people who use services to get a flavour of what did that look like? Was it being done, to what extent, and in what ways? We focused on experiences of support, and again, that area is getting a lot of attention in current Scottish policy, in particular around newly qualified social workers. We looked at experiences of learning and development, again, for obvious reasons, that first year being a kind of critical period and the ongoing learning as a social worker. And the last one, I actually can't see it, my boxes are hiding it. Hold on a minute, because the last one there is professional. The reason I was hesitant is we looked at a couple of things that I've not got on this slide, but the last one there is professional confidence and competence. Trying to get a sense of to what extent did newly qualified social workers feel confident and competent in their role. Other areas that we did ask questions around were in relation to professional identity and professional leadership, and I'm not touching on that here. But it gives you a flavour that in looking at newly qualified social workers' experiences, the study really is looking at lots of different kind of thematic areas within that. And today, really, I'm just trying to give a flavour of what we found in these different areas. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is really just headline findings, an attempt to capture what came through this fairly kind of detailed inquiry. The first message was that for newly qualified social workers, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on their early experiences of practice. We might think that's obvious, but for example, it didn't appear to have a significant impact on this cohort's experiences of education. So just to kind of give you a flavour that we might think, well, of course it did. It wasn't a given, and as we go through the findings, one of the things that emerges is COVID wasn't always the determining factor in experiences. Certainly in education, one of the reasons it didn't seem to be so critical was because of the point that students were at in their learning. So for example, if we were to do this study now, we might find that it's had a much greater impact for students for whom COVID has been a feature for the last 2 years. But at this particular point in the study, it didn't have a significant experience on education, but it had a significant impact on practice. And lots of things I can kind of digress into there, which I won't. But what really came across is, whilst there were impacts on education, the significance of learning in those first few months, in that first 6 months, in that first year, was so significant for NQSWs in practice. When they were thinking about their learning, as much as great store was placed on the education, it was important, they placed such significance on the first stage of learning that takes place in the workplace. So yes, COVID had a big impact, but also that phase of learning is absolutely critical. It's not complete when they step out of uni. It's that first year identified and emerges as a really critical phase. The other perhaps obvious but significant finding from this study was that the impacts and effects of the pandemic were far from uniform. Now we would expect that. We recognise the diversity of individuals, the diversity of organisations, but there was something more than that in the findings. And one of the interesting things about these findings is we conducted a very similar study in 2016. So we conducted online survey and interviews, and for this study we actually used as many of the same questions as we could. The only new questions were, how has COVID impacted on your experiences of education? How has COVID impacted on your experiences of support and induction? So in a sense, we were able to compare the kind of findings that came from this study with those that we collected in 2016. Now, a lot of things have happened since then beyond COVID, so it's not that we would be expecting things to stay the same, but one of the things that was markedly different was the plurality of the findings, and even more than that, the duality and the contrast. What we found in this study is that broadly, things kind of fell into three camps, where approximately a third experienced X, another third experienced Y, and another third experienced Z. And broadly, I could describe that as positive, not so positive, and somewhere in between. Those kind of demarcations didn't emerge as strongly in the 2016 data. Yes, there was plurality and diversity in the findings as per individual circumstance, in organisational context. But actually what we found in this study was the findings were very contrasting for a lot of the areas. So that was one of the kind of key things that came out. Yes, COVID's had an impact, but the impact has not been uniform across the workforce. And NQSWs themselves, many of them could see that. Many of them were in touch with friends in another organisation and were able to see, wow, you're experiencing something really different. Your experience of support is wildly different. Your opportunities to learn with colleagues is wildly different from mine. So they saw those differences. In terms of looking at that kind of plurality and duality, what we found, that experiences were highly contingent on individual circumstance, on organisational context, and critically on differing approaches to early career support, learning and development. And that final one was absolutely key. There were some agencies and organisations who were very clear about their duty to NQSWs through COVID. And whilst COVID had an impact, it was mediated by kind of a creativity in the approach to providing early career support. By contrast, some described almost invisible approaches to early career support and development. So quite highly contrasting experiences there. In terms of the other thing, I suppose, there is that was something that came out from our findings in 2016 and across the kind of what we call the parent study, the 5-year study, was that there's quite a lot of variation in experiences of support for newly qualified social workers. And that was particularly pronounced in this study, as we might expect. So unsurprisingly, one of the kind of findings is that efforts to support NQSWs need to better recognise the individualised, situated and temporal nature of this phenomena, and really an enduring phenomena. You know, we may or we may not be emerging from COVID at this point, but the impacts of it for many are enduring. If you think of our students now, as they go into practice, there will be enduring impacts of learning through COVID. And Robin's already touched on the temporal nature of experiences, and that's certainly something that we would highlight, that these findings reflect experiences at a particular moment in time during COVID. And I think for me, the kind of some of I've been looking at some of Joan Tronto's work on ethics of care, and what it means to care and what it means to be a caring institution. And one of the things that Joan Tronto, she's asked in an interview about what are one of the kind of key findings that from her own work around care. What she says is there are not singular but plural answers to questions about what it means to care well. And you know, I don't know if that resonates, but for me, why that's so significant is we were commissioned to do this kind of study in 2016, and there's been a sense in that commission that what we want is for you to tell us what to do to improve the experiences of newly qualified social workers. What do we need to do to get it right? And of course, we all want that. We all want research to provide us with the answers. And I guess the finding from this study and the parent study is there is no single, apologies, I'm distracted here. I'm getting multiple messages from my son at school at the moment. I'm going to turn my phone down, which means, Gillian, you'll need to keep me to time. So for me, that's one of the kind of key messages that often we're looking for. Is it a good experience? Is it a bad experience? Is it positive, negative? Are things okay? Do they need to be better? Actually, what we found was there was no single picture. There was no singular experience. And as researchers and as people who are working with newly qualified social workers, we need to embrace that plurality. And I would say at best, these findings provide us with an opportunity to talk and think through the findings with our workforces, recognizing that the experience will be different for NQSWs emerging this year. They'll be different for those at the midpoint in their career, at the end point. But actually, the kind of value in the discussion was taking time to hear about those experiences and to tune into what they meant for people. Next slide, please, Gillian. And I will try and move through the others a little bit more quickly. Okay, so one of the key areas we looked at, ways of working. Oops. Link to the kind of headline message from the previous slide. I think, yeah, just the next, but we've gone back to, I think, so just on to the next one. Okay, COVID had significant impacts on their early experiences of work, on that transition into the workplace. The key impact was in terms of, I suppose, the kind of what I call the kind of what and how of social work practice, what, where and how rather. Most NQSWs that we spoke to were working at a distance most of the time. There were experiences of being in the office, but mostly they were operating at a distance, and that was a defining experience for them. They were at a distance from colleagues. Critically, they were at a distance from the social work office and some of the protections and opportunities that the office provides. And they were at a distance from people who use services. And those three combined had kind of cumulative effects. You know, it wasn't just about being distant from people who use services, but also being distant from colleagues, or working, you know, having online contacts with people who were using services, but not being able to check in with a colleague and say, did I do that okay? Did that sound okay? Do you think I answered that? So it was the kind of connect between these different things. Home working was typically experienced as lone working. Very often, the qualitative accounts gave an account of a very lonely and isolating experience. And NQSWs, most of them missed the routine opportunities to learn with and from others. It's practically, NQSWs reported very mixed and often poor access to essential digital work tools. They spoke about maybe having access to a laptop that didn't allow them to access the platforms needed to connect digitally. They spoke often about having to use their own electronic tools to work and feeling uneasy about that. One of the things that was particularly interesting, and I don't have time to do justice to it, was the attention they gave to the physical space and the kind of taking on of professional identity in their bedroom, and the struggle to do that as a newly qualified worker. So the office emerged as a really important professional and protective space. So they spoke about the challenge of if you were dealing with something that was quite emotional, or on a call where you were maybe getting shouted at, or it was quite emotionally challenging, it being very hard to handle that within your home space, and also very hard to exercise some of the kind of self-care activities you might exercise in the office. So that the office emerged as a really important space for newly qualified social workers. When there's obvious implications there as we think about current moves to more online and hybrid working. The other kind of key thing, you know, we had a lot of kind of data around experiences of remote working, and what was striking was, in contrast to some of the data around social workers' experiences of that generally, NQSWs were much less positive. Of the 100 plus online participants, a handful, like less than 5 or 6, spoke positively about that experience. And where people identified some positives, for example, saving time and getting to work, it was quickly followed by an account that said that didn't compensate for these negatives. So that remote working appeared to be much more challenging for newly qualified social workers than it did for their more experienced colleagues. And of course, looking at the literature around that and looking at their accounts of that experience, it underlines that early career learning is a thoroughly social and situated process. So again, the kind of implication that we're drawing from that is that we need to pay greater attention to how different and particularly hybrid working environments contribute to professional learning, development and well-being, and not least because these environments contributed in very natural and informal ways. It wasn't through attending a training session, it was through the routine interactions and even the routine sense of safety that came from being near to others. This needs to include attention to the emotional labour of practice. That came up as a kind of key element of the experience, and the implications of this for the spaces in which social work's done. I noticed that there was something came up in the chat there. I'm not seeing the chat just because I get a pop-up. Do you want me to pause for that, or do you want me to come to that at the end?
We could just leave, it's a comment from Tamara, Trish, but we can come back to it at the end.
Brilliant, brilliant. Please to do that. Please do. It's great to kind of have your comments. I mean, the relevance and interest of this is in what it means to you. So please do that. Okay, can we move on? So these are just a couple of excerpts that illustrate some of the things I've been saying. I'm going to just let you read them yourself. So really just speaking to the obstacle of not learning alongside colleagues. And the latter one, I think, really clearly highlighting the kind of struggle of identity and professional confidence when, as interview participant 8 says, when you're just someone sat in a bedroom. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of in-person work, kind of briefly, I want to kind of make sure we have some time at the end here. What we found in this period in service work with people was much reduced. More than that, it was governed by increasingly centralised and or remote assessments of risk. So decisions making about in-person work was typically made by seniors. And work was being categorised in a kind of red, amber, green system, or high, medium, low risk categorisation. And that came across really clearly across, particularly in the 12 interviews where people were getting into detail. And it came across as something that most at that point in time simply accepted. And what we saw was a kind of social work decision making at a distance, and that being taken from NQSWs and made by others. Relatedly, most newly qualified workers spoke to the negative impact of restrictions on the quality of in-person work. And that was linked to the challenges of building meaningful and critically new relationships. What was clear was it wasn't just about maintaining relationships through COVID, but for newly qualified workers, these were new relationships. And the challenge of doing that at a distance. They spoke about things like, being in a car with a child, but having to have the windows down so that you were kind of ventilating and it was freezing, or spending time with a young person with particular emotional and or behavioural needs, and just not being able to get near. The things that allow us to build relationships through informal ways, and that kind of emphasis on the informalities of practice came across really strongly. Some in reflecting on in-person work felt that they were being socialised into an increasingly administrative and techno-rational form of practice. So the consequence of reduced in-person work was more time on a screen, more time on a computer, more time filling out reports or assessments or writing. And there was a sense of, this wasn't what I thought social work would be. Now, of course, that's a message that came across in 2016, that some NQSWs questioned the administrative and kind of technical forms of practice that they found themselves in. It was more pronounced here, and for these participants, it was linked to changes linked to COVID. And there's real questions which we'll maybe get to at the end about the kind of enduring legacy of these things on forms of practice for social work. Interestingly, a small number, perhaps not surprising given this stage of practice, described working outside of the rules. What was interesting about that was working outside of the rules wasn't prompted by crisis or emergency or risk. It was almost always located within a discussion about trying to work with people in more social, humane, and caring ways. So when people spoke about stepping outside of practice, they spoke about stepping outside of the rules. They spoke about doing so for social reasons, for this attempt to reclaim a more socially just practice. Next slide. Okay, moving on to support. Support was one of the key areas we looked at, and really trying to understand experiences of support through COVID. And part of that is in the parent study. That's been a key area. One of the things we were commissioned to look at was experiences of support for newly qualified social workers and how that might be improved. Probably one of the most interesting and surprising things about this study, COVID coloured everything, you might say, whether in small or greater ways. Where COVID appeared to have no impact whatsoever was in relation to supervision. Almost all of our NQSWs, or certainly similar to those reporting this in 2016, reported regular and positive experiences of formal support, and specifically supervision. And what was striking, for all the disruption, COVID did not appear to disrupt supervision. Now that didn't mean that supervision didn't change. Many of the participants were having supervision online. Sometimes the kind of duration of it was altered. But in terms of the frequency and the quality of supervision, it was broadly unchanged. And when we looked into that more, what that appeared to reflect was that as a profession, we were very clear about the place of supervision in professional support. And it was something that was protected even in a period of significant change and crisis. And it speaks, I think, to where supervision sits within the profession and within our kind of professional priorities. And I think that's great. A lot of work has been done in the last 5 to 10 years about strengthening supervision. And there's work to be done there about the kind of content of supervision. But what we found was that experiences of supervision were positive and broadly consistent with standards reported in 2016. By contrast, experiences of informal support were much more varied. And again, it speaks, I think, to the value and priority we give to these other mechanisms of support. However, for the social workers in this study, informal support was as critical, if not more critical, to them as formal and supervision. So experiences of informal support identified as critical by these participants were much more varied. Unsurprisingly, physical distance from colleagues was a key obstacle to positive experiences of informal support, though it's important to note that people were able to get over that obstacle for supervision and formal mechanisms of support. Also importantly, when we looked at informal support, again, we saw this kind of 3/3 pattern emerging, where some individuals experienced excellent informal support, albeit in new and different ways. And it was very clear that some teams and organisations had been more able to overcome the obstacles of distance and remote working than others. And again, there was a kind of clear sense of intentionality there. There was a sense of just individual culture of teams and or just the commitment of individuals. But broadly, there was a recognition of newly qualified social workers as needing particular forms of support or benefiting from particular forms of support. So a kind of mixed picture, broad consistency around formal support, but wildly varying experiences of informal. And the kind of conclusion for us in here and also in the parent study is it's great that we've made clear strides in improving the quality and consistency of supervision. We need to now extend that to informal mechanisms of support and think about how do we bring that into a similar place of focus and priority. And I think we're broadly thinking about informal support as an important professional development tool. And again, what is it that we need to do to ensure that that's not just the kind of luck of the draw of which particular team you find yourself in. I think the next slide has a couple of examples, quotes that speak to that. Again, the quotes illustrate the kind of diversity of responses in here. But one of the things they also illustrate was a sense for newly qualified social workers of they knew they could pick up the phone and ask for help or contact someone, but they were often very reticent to do that for fear of bothering their colleagues. Whereas the second one clearly shows that, and it was others said similar, clearly shows that some individuals, some teams took the initiative, and that was one of the key differences, was where teams and organisations seem to be committed to taking the initiative there. Okay, if we move on. Just about there.
Sorry, Trish, just to say, just about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to move through these two fairly quickly because we are just about out of time. Learning and development, we've got this one in learning and development. Similar messages here, contrasting experience of learning and development. And I've already spoken about the kind of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 mix. And again, that was in clear contrast with our findings from 2016, which were reported in 2017. The key thing here was, yeah, COVID's presented clear obstacles to experiences of learning and development, and I don't think we need to speculate too hard to understand why that might be. But what was critical in the findings is COVID wasn't the determining factor. The determining factor was the extent to which organisations identified alternative and creative ways of providing learning and development opportunities, both formally and informally. So, for example, some organisations made a point of making sure that their newly qualified social workers were in the office some of the time with peers that they could learn with. Others didn't do that. Some organisations made a point of making sure that there were learning opportunities beyond the mandatory online requirements. Others didn't. So quite a varied pattern there. Positive accounts broadly highlighted the value of a structured, blended and multimodal approach, including attention to formal and informal. And that links to a lot of the work that's taking place at the moment around a supported first year. What does that need to look like to give a good first year experience, specifically with opportunities for learning and development? By contrast, negative accounts associated with poor employer recognition of NQSW's particular needs, of professional isolation, so not having these opportunities to learn with colleagues, and a reliance on mandatory opportunities, and sometimes mandatory interdisciplinary opportunities, so not even being able to come together as social workers, but within a kind of interdisciplinary context. Can you move to the next one, Gillian? Again, just a couple of quotes there showing that the kind of contrast in experiences. And if you just want to move that on. Last one, I'm not going to labour this, it's one of the ones that there's a lot of learning to be taken out of, both here and in the parent study. We can be obsessed with professional competence, and we've got all sorts of attempts to kind of measure it. Actually, our parent study shows that confidence and competence are quite different things, really our attempts to kind of measure and report on that are fairly underdeveloped. Putting that to the side, again, accounts were contrasting here, and they really highlighted the developmental nature of confidence and competence. And the key message here is newly qualified social workers don't enter practice ready. They enter practice with a significant amount of learning, knowledge, skill, and a significant amount still to learn, and they learn that critically in practice. Positive accounts of confidence and competence were associated with good quality placements, and we could spend a whole session on that. They were also associated with good quality practice opportunities and opportunities for learning and support in practice. So those kind of two things being absolutely key. It's not just what the NQSW comes with from the HEI, it's about what are the opportunities for learning through practice in offices, with colleagues, in communities in that first year. Negative accounts, similar to before, associated with isolation, practising at a distance, and limited access to support. Broadly, accounts of confidence depend heavily on the extent to which all of us have been able to provide critical support, learning and development opportunities, albeit in new and creative ways. And the implication there that I kind of move on to is, what came across loud and clear is social work is a practice-based profession. And that first year and the kind of confidence that we want to grow out of it depends on supported opportunities for practice-based learning. And that's really what these slides and this study is all about. How do we maximise the opportunities for professional socialisation and learning in that first year, even through periods of change and crisis? Final, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, nothing for me to say here. This is simply a kind of recap of what the study found and some of the kind of questions it raises for us, but really it's over to you. Really kind of happy to hear any thoughts, questions that you might have.
Thank you so much to both of you. There's so much food for thought here, and I'm going to open it up now for questions.